Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. It's a great day at Carl Albert State College, and today I want to talk about narration. It is our next mode of writing, and you're going to see a lot of continuation from the description mode, which is pretty cool because we use a lot of description when we tell stories, and that's really what narration is. So I want to get started with that, talk about what narration is, how it works, and kind of introduce our new text because when we get into Frederick Douglass, I really think you're going to like it. So let's get into it. And I just got to do a couple clicks here. Okay, so narration has to do with telling stories, but when we talk about narration in writing, it is showing rather than telling. So let's look at how we actually narrate stories. When we narrate, we're telling a story that's usually based on a personal experience or something that helps a reader relate to our ideas. Sometimes our stories are written, sometimes they're oral, sometimes, we just imagine them. Anybody who writes fiction, then we're reading narratives. They could be short, long, they could be poets, they could be a whole bunch of different things. But the purpose is to draw the reader into the story, into an event, into something that we're describing, so they see it the way that we want them to see it. Now, it requires a very clear purpose. Anytime that we narrate something, there's got to be a reason for it, at least, especially when we're in the academic narration. And when we're reading our text, Frederick Douglass, Learning to Read and Write, we're going to see that he has two clear purposes. And that means in order to know the purpose, you also have to understand the audience, understand who it is that you are speaking to, and kind of think about what the audience needs and wants to know. Once you get that down, you know where you're headed because you know how to address those issues. That also means that you're going to have to give details. So kind of like back in description, when we talked about show, don't tell, the details make everything come to life. So you'll see that those details add to the purpose. They help explain the purpose for the audience. Now, on the bottom right-hand side, we've got some essentials. And you're going to see a lot of kind of clear crossover here with description as well. Of course, we've already talked about the purpose and the audience. The storyline has to do with the organization. It's got to be clear. You got to make sure that you're not just jumping around trying to describe stuff, and the storyline doesn't really flow very well. So in order to do that, you want to make sure that your organization is very clear, that there's a logical progression of ideas. You're going to see that each idea needs to be completely related to the ultimate purpose or the thesis statement. And all those details that you describe or narrate also have to add to the whole. If you're giving those details that show the story rather than just talk about it, your reader is going to become more engaged, and that's really what we want. We're going to see that when we read and analyze Frederick Douglass, you're going to really get into his story because of the effective language that he uses. So you're going to see a lot of the description there, but it's going to do it. And all of that leads to that clear organization, the strategic timing of it. So that means that there's a clear purpose for every stage of the story, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And even though we're only doing one chapter of Frederick Douglass's, the narrative of life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, this is chapter 7, Learning to Read and Write. You're still going to see how he's very strategically covering each point that he's going to make, but he doesn't take forever to do it, and he doesn't just gloss over it and rush through it. So that's where that strategy comes in, the very purposeful choice of language and the coverage of each point. And everything is going to lead up to this wonderful conclusion that is satisfying to the reader because it leads to that point. It leads to that takeaway. That's what makes narration really good. So I've got a couple examples here of showing rather than telling. And if we go back into like the election, 2016 presidential election, and we have Hillary Clinton calling Barack Obama and saying, Obama, I lost the election. It's over a phone call. And she cries out with sorrow to President Obama that she had lost the election over a private during a private phone call, and the polls were officially announced. Now, is she going to be overly emotional? Is you going to see that? And we see Obama, I lost the election. She's going to be kind of ticked off. She's going to be upset. She's going to have some of that kind of over emotion that's going to be so much at stake. And we're going to be able to see that in the writing. It's not going to be like, yeah, I lost. It kind of sucked. That's not what's going to happen. So when we see those things happening in narration, you're totally going to get it as a reader and kind of get into the story. We look at some of those strategies, those development strategies, and how the narration works. This is where we get into who, what, why, when, where, and how. So, for example, if I'm trying to write a story about my own financial responsibility, and this is a topic that I've had a lot of freshmen do, and my purpose is to show that I'm financially responsible. How do I develop those ideas? So asking these W questions with an H is going to help. So who is this going to be about? Me, I'm going to try to make it on my own for the first time. Maybe this is my first time in the dorms. Maybe it's first apartment. If you've ever been out on your own, you know how tough it can be, especially if you're by yourself. So what are we going to be talking about? Oh, I'm going to have to talk about the different expenses because now I'm responsible for rent and food. Students, I got to do tuition, the books, recreation, my transportation, like all of the things. If I want to do Netflix, I've got to pay for that. All of those things that are expenses, we tend to call it adulting today, but man, that's a lot to talk about. So how am I going to do that? When is this happening? My first year in college, and that's a big deal. Where, if I'm in residence in college, if I'm in the dorms, or if I'm in an apartment or a house or something like that, if I have a roommate, there's differences. But why? Why is this so important? Why does the reader care? And it's because I want to learn how to balance a budget. This is a big deal, and part of that learning how to adult. So how are we going to do this? How is the story going to come about? And if I say through trial and error, that means that I should have some different examples, maybe some failures, maybe where I planted on my face, but maybe some successes and some lessons learned. And there's going to be a lot of pieces of advice from others that are going to lead to the conclusion. Here's another idea that I've had students write about the worst day they've ever had in their life. And sometimes it's about going to college. So who would be me explaining my worst day at school? So what happened? What made it the worst day? So here, my alarm didn't go off. I was late for my first class. I failed a history exam. I missed lunch. My girlfriend called and canceled our date. And I forgot about baseball practice. And like all of these things happen all in one day. It's probably not a very good day, is it? So when did this happen? If it's like the first semester in college and things just start piling on, where did it happen on campus and why? The whole day started wrong. It's that cause and effect kind of idea. So what happened that made me late for class? It made me fail the history exam. My whole alarm didn't go off. So the how comes in. How is this important? How does this like actually connect? I lost in control of the entire day, and I hope that it's going to be better tomorrow. That might lead into a solid conclusion. So these are some of those kind of strategies that you can look at. And when you analyze narration, you can look at these 5 W's and an H to help you analyze the text. So when we're reading it, what we're trying to do is understand the context, the details that are happening within the storyline. kind of get those main points. When we're looking at the details, this is where they're showing us the narration, and we're going to see where Frederick Douglass shows us children that he meets. He shows us the different strategies that he uses. He's going to give us examples of reading the signs of the docks and those things. He's going to give specific examples of how he tricks some kids into helping him learn to read. And instead of just saying, yeah, I learned to read and write, it was tough. He shows us how he did it, and it draws us in as a reader. So when we're reading it, ask yourself, what is the purpose? What is the author, this illustrator, trying to get across to us? And even think about exactly who is the audience. When Frederick Douglass first wrote his autobiography, his first one, then he's not thinking, oh, in 2022, college freshmen are going to be reading this in Comp 1. He had no idea that would happen, but what he was trying to do was show people in the United States and across other nations in the globe that slavery was bad and we shouldn't do it. He didn't just tell us this though. So what we're going to be able to do is look at his storyline and the various points that he makes and be able to see where he's going. We'll be able to interact with that story. All the details, think about how he relates each example. You're going to see how Frederick Douglass will introduce an idea, and he's going to help by showing it to us. He's going to give us examples and descriptions that are going to be very, very vivid. For example, when he talks about the mistress, this is going to be a major kind of important person in his life. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but total major person. So when he talks about the mistress, he describes her in various ways, and he describes a transformation that takes place as he watches her throughout this narrative of the chapter. So those details are going to help him give that purpose and that meaning to us as a reader. Those kind of details show us who the mistress is, show us who Frederick Douglass is. And keep in mind, he's only a kid at this time. So it's kind of important to see. Now, the organization, you're going to see that one idea will lead into the next, that he transitions each kind of scene in his narrative into the next one. And they all head towards the same conclusion. That's going to be really important as we get it, because we'll be able to see how his strategic timing actually functions to draw us through the journey of his narrative. That's really important in any good narration. So as we get to the conclusion, we're going to be able to kind of see, all right, here is where we ended up from where we began, and look at all of those ideas. What are the takeaways? What are we supposed to learn from this text? Just like any narration, there should be a few takeaways, and I'm telling you, you're going to have several. So when we're writing it, it's the same essentials that we want to look at. Look at your purpose, look at who you're talking to, explain those same points. That's why we're using Douglass as a model, because he's so good at it. So kind of think about in your pre-writing activities, like, what am I trying to get across to this reader, and how can I do that the most effective language, through the most effective language that we can? How can I organize my ideas so they don't just make sense, but they're also really engaging and leads the reader into that conclusion so they get it? That's what we want, like that aha moment. So as we look at that, we got to think about that strategic timing and how we pace ourselves through the narration. So kind of think about it. And then as you go through any type of narrative, you got to look at not just the pre-writing, but the whole writing process. So that's going to be key. Let's take a look very quickly. I've got an image for you that's going to show you Frederick Douglass real quick, if I can get it up. This is a quote from the text, and there's a lot of images. You can Google Frederick Douglass and you're going to see it. Here's one that says, "The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever." And it sounds kind of confusing right now, but you haven't read the text yet, so that's okay. What I want you to do is kind of think about his descriptive language and how he brings to life his story. One of the best pieces about Frederick Douglass is really that he's able to bring to life his experiences for the reader. And we are looking at, way over 100 years ago, and we can still connect to it today. And that's what makes him such a wonderful author. You're going to learn about him being a public speaker. He was known as a great orator. I always want to think of him as like this big, kind of this larger than life kind of figure with a voice like James Earl Jones or Lawrence Fishburne or Denzel Washington, like all these people who are just like big, kind of almost like larger than life, because that's kind of what he is in history. Now, Frederick Douglass, aside from being an orator, later in life, he was also a deep, close personal advisor to President Abraham Lincoln. For example, when Lincoln was trying to think about and trying to get Black soldiers to fight for the Union in the Civil War, he went to Douglass and he was like, "Dude, what do I do?" And Douglass says, and I'm totally paraphrasing here, Douglass says, pay them the same as white people and to treat them the same as the white soldiers. And we will see in history where the Union had specific elements of Black soldiers. Now, yes, there's a lot of racism. Yes, there's a lot of segregation and all these things. Excuse me. But we do know that as they were fighting for the Union, that it made great strides towards equality. And Frederick Douglass was a major component of that. He was also famous in international circles. He would tour, and he was huge, huge in England. They loved him over there. And he would tour the United States, and he would give speeches, and he would recruit for the anti-slave movement. We're going to see him. Now, that's as an adult. This is after he escaped slavery and moved to the North. And that's pretty dangerous when you think about it. But what about when he was a kid? Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, and all that actually means, like, he never knew what it was to be free until he escaped. And even then, he still had the boundaries of being Black and being an escaped slave, being formal. And when you think about that, we don't really connect to that very well. It's really hard. But I think you're going to find some eye-opening descriptions as we see him discuss his life, his early life. This is an older man speaking about his childhood. And this chapter is learning to read and write. So the focus isn't his whole escape and all that kind of stuff. The focus is how he actually learned to read and then learned to write. Think about, as we start connecting, think about how you learn to read and write. Most of us had a traditional instructor. We went to school. We had parents or grandparents or family friends or whoever it was. They read books and we saw pictures and we learned our colors and our numbers and all of these things. And it all kind of revolves around school. He didn't have any of that. He was a slave. So when we look at Douglass, we see that he's got these different strategies at work. He calls them stratagems. There's a reason for that in the vocabulary. But he brings to life his childhood and we see different elements of it. I want you to think about that as you get into the text, and that should help you understand him a little bit better. So this is all about narration. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Obviously, I can geek out about this stuff all day long. So I won't keep you any longer, but if you ever have any questions at all, or just want to stop and say hi, or even Zoom, just let me know. Contact me, email, cell phone, text message, whatever works for you. Have a great day, guys. Thank you for spending your time with me.